They already have hold of him when the priest begins. The room is tight, too many people pressed in around the bed. The air heavy and still, like no one's opened a window in hours. A single lamp throws a low light across the mattress, catching on their hands where they're gripping his arms. One man on each side, another braced at the foot of the bed before the first word is even spoken. The boy is flat on his back, staring up, but he doesn't stay that way for long. The moment the priest starts, his shoulders lift off the mattress and his back arches hard enough that the frame beneath him gives a sharp creak. The men holding him shift their weight immediately, tightening their grip as one of his arms twists free for a second, his hand pulling up before it's forced back down against the bed. The other man leans across his chest, pressing him flat as his body lifts again under their hands. The priest doesn't stop. His voice stays even, steady, cutting through the room while everything else strains around it. The movement comes again, stronger this time, pushing up through the boy's back and shoulders, forcing the men to lean in harder just to keep him from rising off the bed. At the foot, both hands are pressed down across his legs now, bracing against the sudden pull as his hips lift and twist, the mattress shifting beneath him. They don't let go. They stay over him, adjusting, tightening, catching whatever slips free, because each time the priest's words continue, his body reacts again, lifting into them before dropping back and driving upward again before anyone has time to reset. No one in the room is standing back. They're all focused on him, and none of them are stepping away. What you just heard is the part people remember. The moment where it's already out of control, where it's been handed off to priests and turned into something people recognize as an exorcism. But that's not where this story starts. This is the case that would go on to inspire The Exorcist. And like most stories people think they already understand, the version that stuck around isn't the one that actually happened. Because before any of that, before there were priests in the room, before anyone was trying to force something out of him, this was just a kid in his house with something happening that no one could explain. And that is where it all begins. I'm your host, Robert Barber. In 1949, a 14-year-old boy in St. Louis became the center of a case that would involve his family, multiple priests, and a series of events no one in the room could explain or control. If this case sounds familiar, it should. But this isn't the version people usually tell. This isn't the story of the house. It's the story of what happened before it ever became one. This is the story of the St. Louis exorcism case and what was documented as it unfolded. Let's get into it. It starts in a house where nothing like this ever happened before. Roland is 13, living at home with his family, and there isn't anything about him that would make you expect what's about to happen. There's no history of behavior like this, and nothing that points in this direction. The first thing they notice is the sound. It happens at night, after the house has gone quiet. A single knock from somewhere inside, not at the door and not from outside, but from within the house itself, close enough that it doesn't make sense. His mother hears it first. She waits for it to repeat. When it does, she gets up and checks the hallways, then the next room, expecting to find something out of place. Nothing is. The house looks exactly the way that it should. The next night, it happens again. Same sound, same kind of knock. close enough that this time both of them are listening for it, trying to catch it as it happens instead of reacting after the fact. It doesn't settle into a pattern. It just keeps showing up. After a few nights, they stop trying to explain it the same way. They're not talking about pipes or boards anymore. They're listening for it before it happens. That's when the movement starts. At first, it's small enough that you could miss it if you weren't looking directly at him. A shift in the bed under Roland's back. A slight lift that drops almost immediately. Just enough to catch attention, not enough to explain it on its own. His mother sees it. She watches it happen again. The next time, it's stronger. The bed lifts under him and drops hard enough that it makes a sound when it hits. Now there's no question about whether it moved. She calls his father in. He sees it too. They both move closer. The next time it happens, he reaches down and presses his hand into the mattress, trying to hold it in place as it lifts. It doesn't hold. The bed pushes up under his hand, lifting through it and dropping back into place. He adjusts his grip and leans more of his weight into it, pressing down harder, trying to meet it before it rises again. The next movement comes faster. The mattress lifts under him, stronger now, pushing through his hands and dropping hard enough to shake the frame when it comes back down. He tries to time it, waits for the next one, but it doesn't come when he expects it. And when it does, it's already moving. There's no way to get ahead of it, so he steps back. Not because he wants to, but because there's nothing left to do. There's no holding it down, and no controlling it, and no slowing it. The bed moves when it wants to, and they're standing there, just watching it happen. That's when someone else sees it. A relative visiting the house is there when it happens again. No build-up and no warning. The bed lifts under Roland the same way it had before, rising and dropping without anyone touching it. He steps forward looking for a cause, trying to place it in something he can understand. Then it happens again, right in front of him. There's nothing to point to and nothing to explain. He stops looking for one. That's when they stop keeping it to themselves. They start telling people. From there, it doesn't stay contained to the night. It starts happening during the day, in front of more than just his parents, and it isn't limited to the bed anymore. A chair shifts across the floor near him, slow at first, then again with enough force to make a sound when it stops. No one steps in this time. They step back. They watch it. And then they look at Roland. His reactions are changing with it. At first, it's tension. His body tightens when the movement starts, his shoulders pulling upward like he's bracing against something. Then, it becomes more immediate. He reacts before anything in the room moves. He turns towards something no one else can see, his body responding to it before the sound or the movement follows. That's when it shifts. It isn't the house anymore, it's Roland. And once that line is crossed, they stop trying to manage what's happening around him and start trying to understand what's happening to him. They don't wait after that. And once they bring someone else into it, it stops being something they can manage inside the house. They go looking for help. They don't spend long looking for help after that. And by the time they reach out, they're already past the point of trying to explain what's happening in any ordinary way. The priest who agrees to see Roland isn't walking into it without context. He's heard enough to understand that something unusual is happening in that house, but what he encounters when he sees Roland for the first time doesn't match anything he could have prepared for. Roland is sitting upright, watched closely, and the room has a kind of quiet where No one is speaking unless they have to, like everyone is waiting for something to break the silence. The priest doesn't rush in or try to assert control over the situation. Instead, he holds his position a few feet away, watching Roland for a moment before he speaks, and when he does, his voice is even, steady, no different from how he would address anyone else. At first, Roland responds normally. There's nothing in his voice or posture that stands out on its own, and for a brief stretch, it holds there long enough that it almost feels like whatever had been happening might not surface in front of someone new. That changes the moment the priest shifts what he's saying. He doesn't raise his voice or make a show of it, but the direction of his words changes just enough to alter the tone of the interaction, and the reaction for Roland is immediate. His shoulders pull tight before anything else in the room moves, his posture lifting as if something passed through him. And when he speaks, his response doesn't follow the priest's words. It cuts across them, interrupting in a way that doesn't belong to a normal conversation. The priest doesn't step back or break his rhythm. He continues in the same measured tone, holding the same distance, and as he does, Roland's responses come faster, sharper, no hesitation between them now. Each one lands harder than the last, not trailing off, but pressing forward, and the exchange begins to take on a pattern that everyone in the room can feel, even if they don't fully understand it. Across the room, his father shifts forward before catching himself and stopping short, while his mother doesn't move at all, her attention fixed entirely on Roland. No one tries to interrupt, because this isn't something they can step into the way they'd tried before. It's happening between the two of them now, contained in the space between what the priest is saying and how Roland is answering. The priest adjusts not by raising his voice, but by becoming more deliberate, spacing his words, controlling the pace of what he's saying. And as he does, Roland's reactions sharpen again. His voice rises more quickly, holds longer, pushes harder against each line, and the tension in his body builds with it, visible now in the way that he leans forward as if bracing against something that isn't visible to anyone else in the room. That first encounter doesn't resolve so much as it tapers off. Roland settles just enough that the intensity drops, his responses slowing until they fall back into something closer to normal. But no one in the room treats it as an ending. It feels temporary, like something that stepped back rather than disappeared. When the priest returns, there's no easing into it. The shift happens almost immediately. The moment he begins speaking, Roland reacts, cutting across him from the start, his voice sharper now, more forceful, as if whatever had been building is already waiting for him. The priest holds his ground and continues, and the exchange tightens again, faster this time, with no space between what is said and how it's answered. And then it crosses into something different. In the middle of that exchange, Roland responds in a way that forces the moment to stop and register. Not louder, not drawn out, but precise, timed exactly against what the priest is saying, as if it's locking onto his words instead of reacting to them. It lands differently, and everyone in the room feels it at the same time, not because of the volume or the tone, but because of how direct it is. The priest doesn't break. He continues exactly where he is, and Roland answers again, just as quickly, just as directly, and now the exchange doesn't loosen or fall back into something manageable. It tightens instead, each line met with another, each response coming faster than the last, building on itself instead of resting. By that point, no one in the room is waiting for it to stop. They're watching it happen. Because whatever this is, it's not staying contained there anymore. And once it reaches that point, it stops being something they can handle in the house. What had been happening in short bursts doesn't settle anymore. It carries from one moment into the next, building instead of resetting, and there's no clear point where it breaks or slows down. And with that, the situation changes. Because now it isn't just about understanding what's happening, it's about containing it. And that's when they move him. By the time the exorcism is underway in the hospital, it doesn't feel like something contained to a single session or a single moment. It stretches across hours, then across days, with the same people returning to the room knowing that whatever happened the last time didn't end anything. When the rite begins, the reaction comes almost immediately. And what stands out first isn't just Roland is responding, but how he's responding. His voice doesn't carry the same way it had outside those sessions. It tightens, strains, and then pushes upward, not in a steady rise, but in uneven bursts, cutting across the priest's words in a way that forces both voices into the same space. The priest continues in Latin, measured and controlled, holding the pace of the rite exactly where it belongs, never raising his voice, never breaking the rhythm, even as Roland's voice builds against it. And the effect isn't just interruption. It creates pressure in the room, a sense that the exchange is happening faster than anyone else can process, because there's no pause between what's being said and how it's answered. At times, Roland's responses come so quickly that they begin before the priest finishes the line, overlapping in a way that makes it difficult to separate one voice from the other. The rhythm breaks down completely, turning what should be structured into something uneven and strained, with no clear start or stop to any part of it. That same strain shows physically. His body doesn't stay still between reactions. It holds tension, his shoulders and arms tightening and lifting as if he's resisting something that isn't visible. And when that pressure spikes, it doesn't release. It carries forward, building into the next moment instead of dropping off. The people in the room don't move the way they might have earlier in the case. No one steps in to try and restrain him unless it becomes absolutely necessary. And even then, it's brief, because they've already seen how little effect it has. Most of the time, they hold their positions and watch, not because they aren't reacting, but because there isn't a clear point where intervention would change what's happening. There are moments where the intensity shifts sharply, where Roland's voice drops lower and then rises again just as quickly, pushing harder against the priest's words, and those shifts come without warning. The exchange doesn't build cleanly from one level to the next. It jumps, spikes, then continues, making it impossible to anticipate where it's going. There are moments where the responses don't just interrupt. They land in a way that feels timed. The priest continues the rite, holding the same pace, the same structure, and as he does, Roland answers in a way that lines up with it, not after, not randomly, but directly against it, as if the words themselves are what's triggering the response. It isn't just resistance, it feels deliberate. During one of those sessions, witnesses reported markings appearing on his skin, forming in a way that draws everyone's attention at once. It isn't something subtle that has to be pointed out. It's visible enough that the people present stop watching the exchange and look directly as it happens. And then, just as quickly, their attention shifts back because the exchange hasn't stopped. The priest doesn't pause. And for a moment, the exchange tightens to the point where his voice is nearly drowned out, Roland answering over him with enough force that the words stop sounding like interruption and start sounding like opposition. Then, suddenly, the bed jerks hard to one side. The frame kicks against the floor and the mattress lifts under Roland's back, sharply enough to break contact. his body coming up off the sheet for a second before dropping back down, and the men nearest him grab hold at the same time, one catching his arm as it pulls free, the other leaning across him to force him back into place, and for that split second, the rhythm of the room breaks as their focus shifts from the exchange to keeping him on the bed. The priest's voice carries straight through it, unchanged, and Roland answers over him again, forcing the moment back into the exchange as if the interruption never happened, pulling the room back into the same locked rhythm. For a moment, everything in the room shifts with it. Not because it's over, but because no one is sure what's going to happen next. And then it continues. After that, no one tries to step in. The pattern doesn't loosen. It continues, line after line, response after response, with no clear break between them, until the room itself now feels locked into it. Everyone present focused on the same exchange, aware that there's no point in waiting for it to slow down because it isn't going to. And after hours of that, after voices overlapping, tension holding, and the same pattern repeating without release, it becomes clear to everyone in the room that this isn't something that's going to resolve on its own. It has to be forced to stop. By the time it reaches its final stage in St. Louis, this hasn't been going on for a few days. It's been weeks. What started in late February is carried through March, and by the time the exorcism is underway in the hospital, the people in that room have settled into a pattern of long sessions that stretch for hours, often running late into the night, with no real expectation that any one of them will end differently than the last. The session that finally changes things doesn't announce itself as anything different. It begins the same way the others have, with the priest starting the rite in Latin, steady and controlled, and Roland reacting almost immediately, his voice rising against it, his body tightening in the same way it has in every session leading up to that point. For a long stretch, it holds exactly as it always has, with the priest speaking and Roland answering over him, the exchange overlapping and immediate, leaving no space between one line and the next. Then, somewhere in the middle of it, the pattern shifts just enough to be noticed. When Roland responds, the timing is off. Instead of cutting directly across the priest's words, it comes just a fraction of a second late, allowing the line to carry through before the response lands. It's a small difference, but after weeks of hearing the same rhythm repeated over and over, it stands out immediately, even if no one reacts to it right away. The priest continues without changing pace, holding the structure of the rite exactly where it's supposed to be, and when the next line comes, Roland doesn't answer. The words carry through the room on their own, steady and uninterrupted, and for the first time since the sessions began, nothing pushes back against them. Across the room, the father shifts forward slightly before catching himself, while his mother remains completely still, her attention fixed on Roland as if she's waiting for a reaction to return. It doesn't. When Roland does speak again, the response doesn't carry the same force. It comes later, softer, no longer locking into the same pattern that had defined every session before. And as the rite continues, those gaps begin to widen. Lines pass without interruption. Responses come late or not at all. And the tension that had been holding the room in place for hours at a time begins to ease. Not collapsing all at once, but loosening enough that it doesn't rebuild. That change shows in Roland as clearly as it does in the exchange. The strain that had been constant in his shoulders and arms begins to settle, his posture lowering back against the bed instead of pulling upward as if resisting something unseen. And when the priest speaks again, Roland doesn't respond. He just looks at him, steady and focused, without any reaction building behind it, and there's nothing else there pushing through. The priest continues the rite all the way through, not rushing it and not stopping early, finishing it the same way he has every time before. And when it ends, there's nothing left to answer him. The room stays still afterward, not because anyone is unsure of what they just saw, but because they've seen shifts before that didn't last, and no one wants to be the first to assume that this one will. So they wait. Minutes pass and nothing returns. When the next session comes later, the same thing holds. There's no immediate reaction, no interruption, no rebuilding of the pattern that had defined everything up to that point. And after that, it doesn't come back. By early April, after weeks of sessions that stretched across nights and days, the exorcism is considered complete. Roland recovers, and in the years that follow, he doesn't return to what happened in that room. He doesn't speak publicly about it, doesn't attach his name to it, and doesn't remain connected to the case as it grows into something much larger than the people who were there. What stays with the story isn't a final outburst or a dramatic ending, but that moment in the room when the priest speaks and the silence that follows doesn't feel like relief. It just feels empty. When you step back from the story and look at what was actually documented, the first thing that stands out is how many people were present for different parts of this. This wasn't one person describing something after the fact. It involved family members, multiple priests, and in the later stages, medical staff who were in the room during those hospital sessions. And across those different accounts, certain elements remain constant. The physical reactions, the timing of the responses during the rite, the length of the events stretching across weeks instead of happening in a single isolated incident. That doesn't explain what was happening, but it does narrow the possibilities. It moves it out of the category of something that can be dismissed as a single misinterpretation or a story that changed over time, and into something that multiple people witnessed under different conditions. At the same time, there are limits to what those records actually tell us. There are descriptions of movement, of resistance, of responses that seem to line up directly with what was being said during the exorcism, but there aren't consistent verbatim accounts of what was said in those moments. Most of what exists focus on what people saw and how Roland reacted, not on preserving exact dialogue. That matters because it means we're working with observations, not a complete transcript of events. The same is true for some of the more widely repeated details. Things like markings appearing on his skin are reported, but the specifics vary depending on the source. And over time, those details have been expanded, retold, and in some cases, dramatized in ways that go beyond what was originally recorded. And that's where the story starts to split. There's the documented case, based on what was written down at the time by people who were there. And then there's everything that came after, including the version that would eventually influence the book and later movie, The Exorcist, which took those elements and shaped them into something far more structured and dramatic than what those original accounts describe. When you strip that away, what you're left with is less defined, but in some ways more difficult to categorize. A teenager with no prior history of this kind of behavior. Events that began in the home and followed him into a controlled environment. Multiple witnesses describing physical reactions that don't fit cleanly into a single explanation. And a process that lasted for weeks before it stopped. There are explanations that get applied to cases like this. Psychological, environmental, social, and each of those can account for parts of what was reported, especially when you're looking at individual details in isolation. But none of them fully account for the entire sequence of events as it's described across multiple people over that length of time. That doesn't mean the answer has to be something supernatural, but it does mean that whatever was happening in that room isn't something that fits neatly into a single category. And that's where this case stays. There is one more detail that sits outside of all of that. The identity of the boy was protected. Roland isn't his real name, and it wasn't used publicly at the time. The people involved kept that separate from the case as it became more widely known. He grew up. By most accounts, he went on to work in a technical field, living a normal life without returning to what happened in that room or speaking about it publicly. Some substantiated reports claim that he later worked for NASA, but that's never been confirmed. And whatever was happening in that room, it didn't follow him. When you step away from everything that was reported and just think about what this would have looked like to the people in that room, it stops feeling like a case and starts feeling like something much more immediate. This wasn't a story to them. It was something they were dealing with in real time, over the course of weeks, without any clear way to understand what they were seeing or how it was going to end. They didn't know it would stop. They didn't know if it would get worse. They just kept showing up day after day, trying to hold control over something that didn't behave the way anything should. And if even a part of what was reported is accurate, if the responses, the timing, the way it seemed to react to what was being said during the rite were actually happening the way that they were described, then the implication isn't just that something unusual took place. It suggests something that responds, something that recognizes what was being said, and something that reacts to it in real time. And that's where this starts to move into territory that people don't usually want to sit with for very long. Because if what was in that room wasn't just behavior or stress or something internal, if it was something external, something separate, something that could be confronted and forced out, then the question isn't just what happened, it's what that means. It means asking whether something like that could exist at all, whether something like that could attach itself to a person, whether it could be driven out. And if that's even possible, then it starts to push into something much bigger. Because if something like that exists, then it doesn't exist in isolation. It belongs to something. And that raises questions about everything that comes with it. Not just what we experience here, but what exists beyond it. What happens after? Whether there are things that don't end when we do. And whether those things can reach back into this side of it. None of that is answered here, and nothing about this case proves any of it. But it does force the question into the open in a way that's hard to ignore. And that leaves a different kind of question. Not just what happened in that room, but if something really was there. If something like that can reach into this side of life, what does that mean for what's waiting on the other side of it? This has been State of the Unknown. The St. Louis case doesn't end with a single explanation for what happened. It involves multiple witnesses, events that unfolded over weeks, and accounts that don't fully align under any one explanation. Over time, the story has been shaped and retold, but what remains is what was originally reported, and the fact that it doesn't resolve cleanly. Whether you see this as psychological, environmental, spiritual, or something else entirely, there isn't a single explanation that accounts for every part of it. If you've been enjoying these stories, leaving a rating or review in your podcast app really does help more people find the show. On Spotify, it's just a tap of the stars. On Apple Podcasts, you can even leave a short written review. I read them and I appreciate every one. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next story, just hit follow so it shows up automatically when it drops. If there's a case you think I should cover, you can message me directly at State of the Unknown Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, or TikTok. Until next time, stay curious, because sometimes the question isn't just what happened, it's whether we'd even recognize it if it happened again.